It all started with a grand meeting in the Galactic Assembly Hall, a venue so large and ostentatious that a first-time visitor might suspect the architects had a keen sense of humor. 65 different species, give or take a few who arrived late or left early, chittered, buzzed, flashed, and hummed their usual self-important greetings, each convinced that they belonged to the pinnacle of galactic civilization. No matter how diverse their biology might be, they all shared one trait: an unshakable belief in their own superiority. In the midst of this cacophony of ego, the newest members of the galactic community sat quietly at a corner table. The human representatives, wearing diplomatic uniforms meticulously ironed and pressed, took in the show with polite smiles. One might have thought they were in awe, with their wide-eyed attention and the occasional whispered conversation. But behind those seemingly innocent eyes, the humans were calculating, taking note of every smug remark, every dismissive gesture, and every hint of friction between other species. If there was one thing humans excelled at, it was listening to the people who thought they had nothing to fear from primitive newcomers. The Merrill were the first to approach Earth's diplomats that day. Imagine a feline species with sleek fur, elongated limbs, and just enough predatory grace to make even the bravest observer uneasy. As they padded over, their whiskers twitched with what they probably assumed was refined amusement. The lead Merrill, who introduced herself as Counselor Tenera, purred, "Ah, yes, the humans. We've heard so many curious stories about you. Your physical gestures, your habit of daily sleep, your archaic ballistic weapons. Tell me, are you planning to bring your quaint gestures into official negotiations?" One of the human delegates, Ambassador Cheryl Green, simply bowed her head with that same polite smile. "We do appreciate your insights," she replied, as though taking genuine advice. "We're eager to learn from civilizations as advanced as yours." Counselor Tenera chuckled softly, a purr-like sound that resonated through the translator devices. "Indeed, we Merrill have centuries of experience you might find invaluable. Do let us know if you need help adjusting to more modern standards of diplomatic conduct." And with that final remark, she sauntered off, confident that she had done a gracious service. Nearby, the crystalline forms of the Xylans glittered under the assembly hall's artificial lighting. Their entire bodies refracted the beams in delicate rainbows, and their voices hummed at an INF frequency that made them slightly unnerving to stand next to. One of their senior officials, who introduced themselves as Trianzal, approached the humans with an air of patronizing courtesy. "How fortunate," Trianzal said, voice quivering in the human audible range, "to be among those who can guide you away from your primitive state. We hear you still handshake as a sign of warmth. Fascinatingly archaic. We prefer neural pulses, but each to their own, yes?" Again, the humans bowed, nodded, and jotted notes on their datapads. The Xylans took it as a sign of polite submission. If they had listened carefully, they might have noticed the faint, amused undertone in the human delegates' responses, like a teacher letting a student think they'd aced an exam that hadn't been graded yet. Humans excel at letting others believe what they wish. It's a strategy that has worked wonders on Earth and would soon prove devastatingly effective on the galactic stage. Every veiled insult, every condescending remark, humans wrote them all down, committed them to memory, and thanked the speaker for their kind guidance. Meanwhile, they drafted trade agreements that looked delightfully simple to the unsuspecting alien observer. The hidden complexities, escape clauses, and triggered stipulations were so subtle that one might mistake them for trivial human legal jargon. The official membership of Earth in the Galactic Assembly was formalized in a swirl of pompous ceremony that evening. The Assembly's Arch-Chancellor, a tall Xenian with elongated arms and swirling, color-shifting stripes, gave an hour-long speech about preserving the purity of advanced cultures while deigning to extend a hand to lesser-developed species. A few lines were clearly meant to flatter the humans, but each compliment was undercut by a side note of condescension. "Their curiosity is most endearing, or we hope they someday learn the refined ways of the cosmos." At the end of the speech, the human representative stepped up, offered thanks in their quaint human language, and reaffirmed Earth's dedication to galactic cooperation. Handshakes were exchanged, an antiquated practice, apparently, but the humans insisted on it. When everything was said and done, a cloud of gossip lingered in the corridors. So nice to have a new species, but what exactly did they bring to the table? Agricultural exports from Earth were borderline laughable compared to the cosmic wonders already traded. Human technology, while interesting, was riddled with oddities like ballistic weaponry that no properly advanced species would bother with. The coalition of major powers, Meryl, Xylans, Xenian, and others, privately concluded that humans would remain a footnote in galactic affairs. Let them play with their modest trade routes and their silly cultural artifacts. After all, the advanced species had far more pressing issues to brag about. If only they'd looked closer. Perhaps they would have noticed that human ambassadors were soon found in every corridor of political power. They would appear in the offices of minor trade ministers, forging friendly pacts. They would show up at cultural festivals to exchange knowledge, which generally meant they learned everything they could about the host species' vulnerabilities, while revealing almost nothing about Earth's. And perhaps the biggest clue of all was that, whenever a small species complained of bullying at the hands of the larger powers, a quiet human envoy would appear, offering a sympathetic ear and maybe a minor investment or two. Months passed this way. Humans were left to distribute their charming trinkets, while the big players carried on with what they believed were sophisticated intrigues. No one paid much attention to the trade contracts Earth insisted on signing. More legal nonsense, the others said, and if a few paragraphs seemed unusual, they shrugged it off as yet another quaint idiosyncrasy of a backwater planet. How amusing, they thought. It was not until a certain incident involving a smaller species, the Drell, that a few faint alarm bells began to ring. The Drell, amphibious beings with large, sorrowful eyes, had a habit of being overrun by more aggressive species. When the Xylans appropriated Drell territory for research, the Drell turned to the humans for help, not expecting much, just a hopeful plea. The official response from Earth was all polite condolences, but somehow the problem resolved itself within a week. The Xylans abruptly canceled their research projects and vacated Drell space with minimal explanation. Rumors suggested the Xylans found themselves pinned by contractual obligations hidden in half a dozen trade deals with Earth. Yet no one could verify it. If the Xylans felt threatened, they concealed it behind crystalline pride, claiming they'd simply decided the Drell territory wasn't worth the trouble. The incident was brushed aside as a fluke. Then came the flurry of coordinated sanctions against Earth, a response that would later be formalized under the grandiose title, the Preserve Initiative. The impetus for this move was the shared belief among the galaxy's major powers that humans, left unchecked, might disrupt the carefully balanced hierarchy. The Meryl, who prided themselves on controlling dark energy shipments, suggested that Earth's reliance on these resources was an easy point of pressure. The Xylans thought freezing quantum computing contracts would be the simplest method of strangling Earth's already modest progress. And the Xenian, always concerned about cultural purity, took the moral high ground by declaring Earth's solar system off-limits to civilized beings, to preserve primitive societies from the corrupting influences of advanced ones. The announcement was broadcast on every frequency that existed, with great flair and an undercurrent of smirking triumph. The galaxy watched Earth to see if the humans would panic. Perhaps they would beg for mercy, or at least protest loudly. Anything to demonstrate that the big powers had the upper hand. But the humans merely objected politely. They filed official complaints with precisely the right wording, invoked a few obscure paragraphs of the Galactic Charter, and then fell silent. No outra species, no scading counter sanctions. Instead, Earth went about its business. A curious bystander might have traveled to the solar system to observe the blockade that formed in the wake of the Preserve Initiative. Ships from every major species hovered in a wide orbit around the outer edges of the system, forming a ring that seemed almost beautiful in its geometric precision. The coalition enjoyed putting on that sort of synchronized show. A smaller group of advanced vessels kept watch around Earth, ensuring that no unauthorized trade ships slipped through. Meanwhile, the humans were apparently busy renovating. Industrial centers hummed with new construction, orbital platforms shifted in design, and the asteroid belt became the site of round-the-clock engineering projects. The humans claimed it was for infrastructure improvements, prompting hearty laughter from the coalition. How precious! What could these primitives possibly hope to build that would rival the advanced technologies that had already overshadowed them? The first real sign that something was off came from the Merrill's own shipping ledgers. Merchant deliveries continued to arrive in distant star systems, even systems previously reliant on Merrill's dark energy routes, despite the blockade. When the Merrill tried to investigate, they encountered evasive responses. "Oh, we found alternative logistics solutions." The shipping lanes turned out to be scattered, improvised, and often employed unorthodox drive signatures that confounded typical detection. At first, the Merrill chalked it up to rumor or random smugglers. It wasn't until entire caravans bypassed Merrill-run checkpoints that they began to suspect a wide-reaching conspiracy. Simultaneously, the Xylans discovered quantum computing services popping up out of nowhere. Sophisticated enough to rival their own, these new providers used a simpler approach that required minimal overhead, but it got the job done. The Xylans tried to locate the source of this sudden competition. Their best analysts came up with only one consistent lead: an elaborate web of shell companies with transactions traced to minor species throughout the galaxy and a few scattered references to Earth-based code repositories. That made no sense, though. How could humans, who by all accounts were technologically behind, compete with the crystalline brilliance of Xylan computing? At first, the major powers tried to clamp down harder. The blockade tightened. The ring of ships around Earth's solar system bristled with renewed vigilance. The coalition raised tariffs on any vessel that might have the faintest connection to humanity. Port authorities across the galaxy were instructed to seize suspicious cargo. Communication channels to and from Earth were restricted or outright cut off. Surely, this would break the human spirit, or at least teach them the futility of resisting. Then, in the middle of an emergency meeting to enforce new sanctions, the human ambassador, who hadn't spoken a word since the assembly convened, stood up, wearing the trademark polite smile. They produced a small handheld device and tapped it once. Holographic data sheets flickered to life above the table, revealing an array of plunging markets, evaporating assets, and vanishing supply lines. The charts detailed the fortunes of every major species in the blockade. The ambassadors exchanged alarmed glances, frantic to check their own finances. Sure enough, credits, energy shares, even entire industries had inexplicably started to crater. The more draconian the coalition's new measures, the more quickly their own systems hemorrhaged value. "Ladies and gentlemen of the esteemed Galactic Assembly," the human representative said in a level voice, "before you finalize your vote, you might want to review your personal portfolios." Chaos erupted. Nobody had expected financial meltdown, much less one that could spread so swiftly. They discovered, to their horror, that the so-called primitive trade contracts they'd signed with Earth had hidden triggers within triggers. By enacting certain forms of economic aggression, they had effectively allowed Earth to assume controlling stakes in various markets or reroute entire supply chains to bypass the coalition. Convinced humans couldn't possibly outsmart them in legal matters, they had never read the fine print thoroughly. Even as the coalition members scrambled to regain control of their markets, more crises broke out. Suddenly, entire shipping fleets found themselves contractually obliged to carry human-approved cargo under penalty of losing their government subsidies. Explorers from minor species started ignoring the old hyperlanes in favor of newly discovered micro-jump routes that had been accidentally revealed by humans. A trove of inconvenient evidence about each major race's questionable deals and alliances began circulating. Some called it blackmail. The humans referred to it with a wry grin as reputation management. Meanwhile, in Earth orbit, the so-called renovated platforms roared to life. Factories that were supposedly for industrial upgrades turned out to be high-output manufacturing zones for heavy kinetic weapons, mass accelerators, tungsten rods, and other ballistic implements that mainstream galactic militaries had long dismissed as outdated. But, as the blockade fleet soon learned, energy shields that performed admirably against energy beams were laughably porous against physical objects traveling near light speed. The Coalition's blockade ships found themselves battered by pinpoint strikes that didn't register on sensors calibrated for more advanced weaponry. In the time it took them to adjust, a good chunk of the blockade had been rendered inoperable. Word spread fast across the galaxy. The humans were not only evading the blockade, they were dismantling it. Miners in the asteroid belt had been building warships that combined Earth ingenuity with strategically reverse-engineered alien tech. They weren't the sleekest or the most technologically sophisticated ships out there, but they were so unexpected, with capabilities the Coalition had never prepared for. Micro-FTL jumps allowed them to appear out of nowhere, pepper blockade vessels with ballistic projectiles, and vanish again. Panic gripped the Coalition. They ordered a renewed offensive, but it was already too late. The humans had quietly restructured the galactic market, forging alliances with minor powers and cutting the big players off at the knees. Their new trade networks functioned in parallel universes of commerce, unrecognized by the official channels the Coalition dominated. It was as if, from the moment the humans joined the assembly, they'd been laying the groundwork for a complete takeover of critical infrastructure. The final blow came during the so-called Grand Reaffirmation meeting, hastily convened to deal with the crisis. Every major species showed up, nerves on edge, prepared for some last-ditch legal maneuver or a show of military force. The humans, however, merely placed an ancient paper document on the table. It looked comically low-tech, some centuries-old copy of the original charter that founded the Galactic Assembly ages ago. According to Article 7, subsection 12, the human ambassador explained, any attempt by a block of member species to isolate or economically cripple another member results in the immediate suspension of the aggressor's voting rights. There's also a clause requiring them to pay reparations for every lost credit and every damaged ship, all of which is meticulously logged, of course. The ambassadors of the big powers stared. Not one of them had read the founding charter in detail. Why would they? They had always considered themselves guardians of knowledge and tradition, but evidently, they had skipped the finer points that could one day be used against them. The humans, on the other hand, had read everything, cross-referenced it, and built entire legal labyrinths hidden behind seemingly childlike trade documents. Nothing left to do but swallow their pride and brace for the demands. The humans grinned, dropping the friendly pretense for the first time. The high-handed condescension that the Coalition had inflicted upon Earth now came crashing back in the form of treaties, reparation calculations, and fresh demands that would reorder the galactic balance of power. In the scramble that followed, the Xylans were the first to capitulate. Their quantum computing empire was on the verge of collapse, undermined by new technologies championed by Earth. Crystalline pride, or not, they recognized a losing position when they saw one. Merrill, fiercely protective of their dark energy monopoly, found that, ironically, Earth's new route mapping and alternative power sources had decimated their exclusive markets. The Xenian tried to hold out, proclaiming cultural supremacy until the bitter end. But with their restricted trade routes circumvented, their fleets harried by kinetic bombardments, and their name tarnished by leaked documents that exposed centuries of hypocrisy, they too realized they had no choice but to negotiate. It wasn't just an immediate surrender. It was a complete transformation of the galactic political landscape. The final victory for humanity was not the destruction of the old powers. They didn't need to crush them. They simply offered a better way, or at least a more profitable one. By the time the dust settled, Earth had rallied enough minor species and disgruntled mid-level powers to form a new central body, something politely named the actually United Species, though humans privately called it Operation Fair Game. They claimed its purpose was to eliminate the kind of favoritism and hypocrisy that had once allowed the major species to dominate everyone else. The old coalition members had no choice but to sign on if they wanted any chance of salvaging what remained of their fortunes. Suddenly, trade routes were open to anyone, not just a privileged few. All that was required was adherence to rules that were refreshingly straightforward. No predatory monopolies, no covert deals to undermine other members, and absolutely no more pre-serve initiatives designed to strangle a single world. Every species was encouraged to contribute technology, cultural knowledge, and resources, with robust frameworks in place to ensure mutual benefit. The Xylans, the Meryl, the Xenian, and all their old allies found themselves stripped of the illusions of superiority they had clung to for eons. Because we said so was no longer enough to maintain authority. The day of the smug, paternalistic coalition had ended. For the humans, the greatest triumph wasn't the wealth or the new alliances they built. It was the simple satisfaction of letting the arrogant species realize, step by painful step, that they had walked themselves into every trap. The blockade, the sanctions, the humiliating broadcasts, they had all played directly into Earth's plan, triggering the hidden clauses, turning public opinion against the bullies, and allowing humanity to reveal its carefully cultivated strengths at exactly the right moment. One might wonder why the humans went to all this trouble. Why not simply attack or protest outright? But humanity has a talent for turning disadvantages into advantages, for letting an opponent overextend until it's too late to recover. By allowing themselves to be seen as simple, curious newcomers, they lulled the big powers into a false sense of security. By insisting on petty trade deals, they accumulated the legal ammunition they needed to upend the entire system. By focusing on ballistic weapons and unorthodox FTL navigation, they bypassed centuries of established military doctrine that was unprepared for old-school warfare. In the aftermath, each of the once dominant species tried to save face in its own way. The Xylans claimed, with forced poise, that it was only logical to cooperate with Earth now that mutual economic interdependence had been established. The Meryl insisted that they had always respected human creativity, never mind the logs that showed them mocking Earth's wasteful sleep habits. The Xenian, for their part, retreated into rhetorical flourishes about cultural synergy, though everyone knew they were simply trying to hide the sting of losing control over the so-called quarantine zones they once enforced with impunity. The new actually united species council convened for the first time less than a year after the Great Backfire, as it was colloquially called. A record number of minor species showed up to watch. They seemed eager to see how Earth would reshape galactic policy. Instead of giving them a complicated spectacle, the humans presented straightforward proposals: joint research programs, open-source technology projects, and a universal code of commercial ethics. The old coalition members braced themselves for more hidden traps, but these deals genuinely aimed to promote fairness and growth. The humans had already demonstrated they could outmaneuver the entire galaxy if they so chose. They didn't need more trick clauses. They had earned the right to name the terms openly, and no one dared to cross them. During the official signing ceremony, a junior diplomat from the Xenian side worked up the courage to ask the question that had haunted them since the fiasco began. Why did you let us think you were so far behind? Why not just declare your advancement from the start? A human representative, an older figure with gray streaks in their hair and a measured gaze, responded with a wry smile. Because the best victory is the one where your opponent defeats themselves. We simply offered you the rope, and you eagerly tied the noose. That phrase, offered you the rope, became the signature tagline of every historical account of the Great Backfire. Documentaries circulated throughout the galaxy, showing footage of blockade ships hammered by kinetic rods or economic graphs dropping off a cliff. The moral lesson became impossible to ignore. If you try to betray humanity under the assumption of their weakness, be prepared for a rude awakening. It was not that humans were vindictive by nature. They simply understood strategy in a way that turned illusions of superiority into fatal pitfalls. Over the next few months, everyone adjusted to the new status quo. Trade boomed under the open system. Freed from monopolistic control, smaller species found opportunities to innovate. Cultural exchanges blossomed in ways never before seen. Some might say the galaxy as a whole became a better place, more honest, more inventive, more equitable. The old coalition's rigid hierarchy had often stifled progress, insisting that knowledge had to pass through certain channels, that trade must benefit the largest powers first. Now, a flood of collaborative endeavors propelled the entire galactic community forward. Yet there was also an undercurrent of lingering fear. In the back of every ambassador's mind was the memory of how easily Earth had twisted the galaxy's assumptions in on themselves. They had turned primitive technology into a tactical advantage, naive diplomacy into the ultimate legal stranglehold, and cultural ignorance into a wealth of secret intelligence. Once, the big powers had laughed at humans for being behind the times. Now, they dreaded the idea of incurring humanity's wrath again. The old coalition members often wondered if humans might one day revert to their friendly facade, but the truth was, Earth no longer needed to hide anything. They had earned the respect and wariness of every species in known space. That was enough to keep the playing field level. There were rumors, of course, whispers that humans were still developing fresh ways to circumvent existing technology, or that they were making new deals with species in uncharted systems. But none of it was done in secret malevolence, Earth's biggest threat from that point onward was simply the knowledge of how badly things could go if the galaxy ever decided to revert to the old ways. Years passed, and the great backfire became a case study taught in almost every educational system. Courses included titles like When Overconfidence Leads to Disaster or Interstellar Diplomacy 101. Read the fine print. The story circulated that humans spent decades perfecting a concept they privately called rope-a-dope, borrowed from their historical record of sports and warfare. The idea was simple. Let your adversary wear themselves out on illusions of superiority, then strike with the force they never saw coming. Students from the Merrill Academies, the Xylan Knowledge Centers, and the Xenian Cultural Institutes all studied the events with a mix of fascination and horror. One of the more popular rumors told at cosmic taverns was that the entire fiasco started over something as trivial as an alien remark about human sleep being an evolutionary weakness. Never insult a species that might take your mockery as a strategic challenge. Bartenders would warn with a grin, as travelers from across the galaxy swapped stories of Earth's cunning. Among the more cynical, the phrase, signing your own death warrant, referred to any attempt to sabotage the humans. Did you hear about that rogue pirate gang that tried to hijack a human freighter? They vanished in a swirl of ballistic missiles. Did you catch that scandal about the minor official who tried to block an Earth-led council vote? Suddenly, evidence of their corruption appeared in every major news feed. Yet for all the fearsome anecdotes, the humans rarely flaunted their power. They didn't need to. The new galactic order, shaped by Earth's policies, allowed them to devote their energies to constructive pursuits. They pioneered a wave of cross-species research in medicine, terraforming, and even entertainment. A galaxy that once thrived on secrecy and cutthroat deals now found a surprising benefit in Earth's straight-talk approach. Sure, the humans still had an ironic sense of humor. There were jokes among them about how the old coalition members once tried to teach humans their place. But the vast majority of day-to-day interactions proved that Earth was far more interested in stable, long-term growth than in petty revenge. After all, their best revenge had already been served. After the meltdown, the largest powers of the old coalition tried to get back on friendly terms with Earth. The Xylans submitted proposals for joint computing research, claiming they could reach new frontiers if they combined their crystalline networks with Earth's simpler but effective designs. The Merrill offered to license their advanced dark energy shipping capabilities, provided Earth integrated them into the newly open channels. And the Xenian, though still somewhat aloof, extended a hand for cultural exchange, hoping to salvage at least a portion of their pride. The humans accepted all these gestures, under the explicit condition that everything be done transparently and fairly, with no more double-dealing. For a while, the old powers chafed, but they had no real choice. The alternative was total isolation, and after seeing what Earth had done to them once, they weren't eager to test the humans' patience again. Over the next decade, Earth emerged not as a tyrant, but as something far more unsettling for the once arrogant powers, an organizer. They coordinated multi-species projects, ensuring each participant got a fair share. They enforced the new codes of conduct across star systems that had once been rife with corruption. They introduced open-source technological frameworks, encouraging minor species to contribute ideas that might become the next big breakthrough. In short, they cultivated a galaxy that embraced progress without the stifling strangleholds of old. And ironically, all of it was possible because the coalition had tried to betray them. It's not as though the humans did this out of pure benevolence. They understood that a stable, prosperous galaxy was in their best interest. They also knew that fear remained a powerful deterrent. If any species tried something akin to the Preserve Initiative again, they'd only have themselves to blame for the consequences. The next time, there would be no illusions about Earth's capabilities. In a way that made Earth's position even stronger. Nobody wanted to poke the sleeping bear again, especially a bear that had proven it could juggle legal warfare, sabotage illusions, and ballistic brutality with equal finesse. As the 10th anniversary of the Great Backfire approached, the actually United Species Council announced a commemorative event. They invited ambassadors from every world to gather in the restructured Assembly Hall on Earth, a symbolic reversal of roles from that initial meeting in the old Galactic Assembly Hall. The new hall, while grand, had a practical design that emphasized functionality over pomp. Humans joked that it might be too modest for those used to majestic cosmic architecture, but the universal consensus was that it represented a refreshing break from the old flamboyance. During the ceremony, one of the surviving high officials from the original coalition gave a speech. It was a careful blend of apology and acknowledgement of Earth's contributions. He called the humans indispensable partners and credited them for guiding the galaxy to a more equitable system. Ambassador Cheryl Green, representing Earth, took the podium afterward with a smile that betrayed no malice. She spoke of unity, collaboration, and looking to the future. It was a graceful speech, culminating in a gentle reminder. Let us not forget the lessons we learned the hard way. In a universe as vast as ours, underestimating a friend is almost as dangerous as making an enemy. The audience members, especially those who recalled every humiliating detail of humanity's counterstrike, knew exactly what she meant. The tragedy and the triumph of it all was that the old coalition had indeed signed its own downfall by trying to bind Earth. But that downfall led to a rebirth, forging alliances that might never have existed otherwise. The humans didn't dwell on the grudges. Why would they, when letting go helped them cultivate the image of the benevolent teacher? Still, there was always that slight undertone in their diplomacy, a quiet reminder that they had the power to repeat the great backfire if necessary. Thus, the galaxy settled into a new era. Fewer species dared to claim absolute superiority without backing it up, and even those who still believed in their own elevated status learned caution when dealing with the cunning of Earth. The old aristocrats discovered that building trust could be more profitable than orchestrating betrayals. The smaller worlds found more opportunities to thrive under policies that didn't favor a few major players. And humanity took its seat among the leading species, not as a patronizing overlord, but as an equal with a sly grin and a data pad full of unspoken contingencies. They never did fully abandon their ballistic weapons. Observers occasionally questioned it. Why hang on to something so archaic? The official response was always the same, because sometimes the old ways work best. It had become almost a motto, a playful shrug that concealed the knowledge that those rods and shells had shredded the illusions of invincibility once, and could do so again if needed. More than a few jokes sprang up throughout the galaxy. If you upset the humans, They'll write a contract so thick it'll take you years to realize you sign away your entire planet. Or be careful about mocking their sleep cycles. They might just rewrite the laws of physics while you're laughing. The comedic sting of these remarks was that nobody doubted their underlying truth. Everyone had witnessed how cunning, meticulous, and relentless the humans could be if provoked. In the end, it was that very mixture, practical fairness and hidden steel, that stabilized the new cosmic order. Those who once labeled Earth as merely primitive came to appreciate that this was a species that excelled at turning disadvantages into lethal advantages. The final lesson resonated through every corner of the galaxy. To betray humans is to sign your own death warrant, because humans don't settle for merely winning. They ensure their opponents understand exactly how they lost, so it can never happen that way again. That's what truly frightened the old coalition. Humans didn't want to merely punish their betrayers. They wanted to educate them. By the time the coalition realized the depth of Earth's cunning, all the doors had closed, all the traps had sprung. The final memory left in the minds of those who tried to subjugate Earth was not just defeat. It was the humiliating realization that they had orchestrated their own downfall. Of course, the galaxy at large ultimately benefited from this fiasco, and perhaps that was the grandest irony of all. The so-called primitive species ended up steering galactic civilization toward a future with fewer shackles, one in which raw arrogance no longer passed unchallenged. While it certainly wasn't perfect, old habits die hard, and some resentments never fade. It was a vast improvement over the stagnant regime that had once lorded over every star system. Sometimes, the best catalyst for change is a small, underestimated force that refuses to be crushed. And that, ultimately, was the legacy humanity left. They taught the galaxy a lesson that no one would soon forget. Never dismiss a species that can weaponize your own arrogance. By the time you realize your mistake, you might already have penned your own death sentence. The day the Coalition tried to preserve Earth was the day the galaxy learned just how lethal a seemingly friendly smile could be when backed by quiet resolve, legal ingenuity, and the willingness to turn old-school ballistics into a brand-new form of cosmic warfare. In the quiet intervals between cosmic summits, the humans would sometimes reflect on how this all came to be. They remembered every jibe about their need for sleep or their quaint gestures of friendship. They recalled every time they'd bowed their heads and jotted down notes, pretending to be the eager pupils of species who treated them like children. In many ways, that might have been humanity's greatest strength. They listened. They listened to the jeers, the sneers, and the well-meant condescension, storing each remark away like data points in a master plan. None of it went to waste. Every rumor, every insult, every assumption about Earth's shortcomings became a piece of a puzzle that, when fully assembled, spelled doom for those who had so carelessly handed over the puzzle pieces. Not that the humans gloated, at least not in public. They were far too savvy to let their pride show. Instead, they exchanged knowing looks with each other whenever the old powers fumbled through a meeting or when a Xenian official tried to salvage dignity by praising Earth's unique brand of intelligence. The humans would graciously nod and welcome them to the new era. After all, part of playing the long game is maintaining the impression that you were never playing a game at all. And so the new order continued, with Earth at its center, not necessarily by virtue of might alone, but through an intricate blend of cunning, cooperation, and the lingering fear that no one else could truly keep up. Every new species that emerged from the galactic fringes heard the same rumor. Don't betray the humans. It's not worth it. Trust us. For a species that once struggled to properly calibrate quantum drives without a noise that other civilizations found laughable, that was a monumental leap in reputation. Yet that, in a single phrase, distilled the entire saga. Humans went from being the cosmic underdogs to the quiet authority you definitely did not want to cross. Because in the end, that's the essence of the lesson learned across the stars. When aliens learned that betraying humans means signing their own death warrant, it wasn't just a catchy warning. It was the culminating truth of a grand drama that reshaped galaxies. No matter how superior you believe yourself to be, if your hubris blinds you, A cunning mind can twist your every advantage into your downfall. And Earth, with centuries of practice in turning disadvantages into opportunities, proved to be the cunning mind the galaxy never saw coming. Grak felt the sharp change in atmospheric pressure the moment the transport craft pierced the final layer of Earth's sky. The cabin lights flickered, illuminating his squat, powerful frame and the glint of sweat on his emerald skin. He had spent most of his life training on Corlith, his home planet, at nearly every rigorous military academy possible. He was the strongest warrior his people had ever produced. But in that moment, strapped awkwardly into a human-made harness and surrounded by gear he barely understood, he realized he was about to face a very different kind of challenge. His superiors on Corlith had assured him that no mere human training would surpass his abilities. Still, the details of what exactly these Earth Marines did had been vague in his briefing. Now, with the craft rattling through the final descent, he sensed that he was stepping into an unknown world of tradition, discipline, and possibly madness. He wiped a bead of perspiration off his brow and craned his neck around. Two humans in matching olive-green uniforms were seated nearby, their eyes flicking between him and the harness that half covered his torso. One introduced himself as Thomas, an American Marine from a place called Colorado. The other was Ivan, from Russia, a tough-looking man who wore an expression of perpetual suspicion. Both men radiated that easy confidence Grak had come to associate with elite warriors. There was something else, too, a certain camaraderie he couldn't quite place. They bantered with each other across cultural lines, as though any differences were inconsequential compared to the bond of being fellow Marines. Grak wondered if he would ever feel that sense of fellowship here on Earth. As the craft gave a sudden lurch, Thomas looked over, gave Grak a tight grin, and shouted over the engine noise. "We'll be on the ground in 5 minutes, big guy. Drill Instructor Rodriguez is waiting for you. And for us, I guess." He said it like a joke, but there was an edge of nervousness in his voice, as if he too expected something unpleasant once the craft touched down. Grak merely nodded, forcing a calmness he didn't entirely feel. When the hatch opened, an onrush of humid, hot air struck him. Immediately, the change in oxygen levels made him gasp. The Corlith atmosphere had a higher nitrogen content, and the partial pressure of oxygen had felt denser, more supportive. Here, on Earth, everything seemed stifling but simultaneously lacking, as though his lungs would never truly fill. Dizziness flitted at the edges of his consciousness, but he steeled himself and stomped out onto the tarmac, ignoring the dull throb that surged through his calves. He wore heavy boots adapted to Earth's environment, but they were clumsy compared to what he was used to. A wave of heat shimmered above the asphalt under the midday sun. Beyond the landing zone, Grak could make out rows of squat, utilitarian buildings, each with a plain gray facade. Soldiers, Marines as they called themselves, hurried about in neat lines, carrying equipment, shouting orders. The entire place reeked of discipline and odd, sort of controlled chaos. From the corner of his eye, Grak saw a figure march forward with near-mechanical precision, wearing an odd-brimmed hat that cast a sharp shadow over severe features. This had to be the infamous drill instructor Rodriguez. "Welcome to Earth, warrior," came the crisp greeting. The voice held no warmth. Rodriguez's gaze traveled up Grak's imposing body, scanning the cords of muscle that bulged under his uniform. She maintained an air of calm intimidation, exuding the same iron discipline that colored every aspect of the base. "We don't have a fancy ceremony for you. You're here for one reason, to complete our Marine boot camp." "Understood." Grak squared his shoulders, inclining his head in what he hoped was a respectful gesture. "I understand," he replied, his translator implant giving his voice a strange mechanical resonance in the human's language. He expected a moment of formality, perhaps a second to adjust to the environment. Instead, he found himself being hustled along, rushed toward a waiting helicopter near the far end of the tarmac. Its rotors spun, kicking up a fierce wind that rattled everything around them. Thomas slapped Grak's broad shoulder. "We're starting with a bang," he said, raising his voice to be heard. "Halo jump. Or, well, a variation of it. courtesy of that contraption on your back. You'll do great. It came out as half encouragement, half mischief. Next to him, Ivan smirked. First time is interesting, he murmured in an accent that Grak's translator found strangely melodic. Before Grak could protest that maybe he needed instructions on how to operate the jetpack harness, the group was ushered onto the helicopter. Within minutes, the whir of the blades and the buffeting wind signaled they were lifting off. Earth's gravity tugged at Grak's innards in a different way than Corlitha's, making him feel heavier than usual. Or perhaps it was just nerves. Thomas and Ivan strapped themselves in near the open side door, while Grak fought to buckle into a seat clearly designed for someone narrower and shorter. His translator implant picked up chatter from the pilot and co-pilot. They were ascending to 10,000 feet, waiting for clearance to jump. Then came the shove. Thomas shot him a wicked grin and said, "Time to earn that bragging right, big guy," before slamming an open palm between Grak's shoulder blades. Grak felt the world spin. In one moment, he had both feet on the helicopter floor. In the next, he was free-falling, the roar of wind drowning out his roar of shock. Adrenaline surged through his veins, or the Corlith equivalent of it, causing his hearts to pound in near unison. Below him, the green-brown surface of Earth's training grounds rushed upward at an alarming speed. He flailed, tried to find the controls for the jetpack. He had only glimpsed them in the craft, some handle, a few levers, a digital readout. But now, tumbling in midair, it was impossible to make sense of which switch did what. His translator snagged on a panicked thought as he growled something in Corlathian. All the while, the Earth soared up to claim him. Just when dread reached its peak, the jetpack roared to life. The jolt was so powerful that it nearly snapped his head back. Instead of continuing to plummet, his body slowed, then stabilized. The harness's thrusters blared, guiding him with a surprising smoothness across a wide expanse of air. He glimpsed the shapes of Thomas and Ivan, their own packs engaged, descending with practiced ease. Within a minute, Grak clumsily found himself hovering close to the ground, with a pack abruptly cut power, letting him drop the final 2 meters into a graceless sprawl on the grass. Flat on his back, chest heaving, he could see the helicopter overhead. It made a wide circle, then flew off toward the horizon. The taste of dirt mingled with the bitterness of embarrassment in his mouth. Earth training was humiliating already. His broad limbs ached, but there was no serious injury. He felt the weight of the harness shift as he pushed himself up and spat grass out. Thomas and Ivan landed nearby, hardly winded. "Not bad," Thomas said, pulling off his own harness. "We've seen worse first tries." Ivan nodded, looking almost disappointed that Grak was still conscious. "Just part of the tradition," he said. "We jump together. Build trust." Grak's translator hiccuped over the phrase "build trust," rendering it into his mind as "learn unity." He snorted. On Corlith, trust exercises rarely involved hurling each other out of an aircraft without warning, but apparently humans had a flair for dramatic rites of passage. An hour later, Grak found himself in the thick of the base. Lines of recruits marched under the unforgiving sun, a chorus of shouted cadences filling the humid air. He was introduced to Sergeant Mullins, a wiry instructor who guided him to a medical checkpoint for basic tests. The Earth physicians poked and prodded, measuring lung capacity, heart rate, reflexes. They seemed fascinated by the presence of 2 hearts, the rhythmic interplay of which occasionally confused their machines. Grak endured the tests in stoic silence, wanting nothing more than to rest in a pressurized environment that approximated Corlith's. But there would be no reprieve. Mullins pointed him toward the barracks, stating he had 10 minutes to stow his gear before falling into formation. By the time he reported to the squad bay, he was drenched in sweat, and his uniform chafed at the seams. Humans apparently functioned well enough in this climate, but his physiology found it draining. The translator implant hissed softly, indicating it had difficulty filtering out the overlapping voices of the bustling recruits. The squads were preparing for a routine called drill. Grak saw men and women of varying heights and builds, all standing rigidly, rifles held with practiced discipline. Their eyes flicked his way, curiosity obvious, but no one dared speak out of line while instructors patrolled. He heard his name called, Grak, front and center, and obeyed, stepping out of line with as much composure as he could muster. He realized that from the vantage point of these humans, he was towering, nearly 7 feet tall, thick cords of muscle bulging beneath emerald-toned skin. Maybe this was part of why they liked to test him. Humans always sought to probe the extremes of any new phenomenon. "All right, recruits," barked a new voice. Drill instructor Rodriguez had returned, pacing like a caged tiger. "We have a special guest. He's from Corlith, and apparently, he's their idea of a super soldier. We're going to show him what the Marines can do, and he's going to show us if that fancy alien muscle is worth a damn in real training. Today we'll start with a little warm-up. 20-mile. March with full packs." A collective groan might have escaped if the recruits were less disciplined, but they all suppressed it with stony faces. Grak's heart sank. He had heard of the famed Ruck March, a standard test in Marine training. He had never marched that distance in Earth's gravity before, but retreat wasn't an option. Thomas and Ivan ended up in the same squad, sending him encouraging nods. The instructors handed Grak a rucksack filled with gear that weighed close to 80 pounds. If he'd been on Corlith, it would have felt manageable. Here on Earth, with this heavier gravity pressing down, it felt like a lead coffin strapped to his shoulders. They set off at a punishing pace. Even for the human recruits, it was challenging, but they were accustomed to it. Grak, in contrast, found his lungs straining. His dual hearts pounded in a regular rhythm as they tried to compensate for the different oxygen levels. Step after step, mile after mile, the route wound through forest trails, up and down gentle hills that felt like mountains to his foreign physiology. His muscles, so accustomed to raw power, were unprepared for the endurance required. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, while the chafe of his uniform against alien skin turned into a persistent burn. Thomas dropped back to march beside Grak, quietly murmuring, "Hang in there. Don't think about the distance. Just keep your rhythm and keep sipping water." He pointed at the hydration tube attached to the pack. Grak grudgingly nodded and took a few pulls of lukewarm water, tasting faint plastic. It didn't slake the thirst that seemed to grow each time he blinked. Still, it provided some relief. He recognized the gesture as kindness, something unexpected but not unwelcome. By the 5th mile, Grak was fighting the urge to stop. With each footstep, it felt like the ground dragged at his boots. He occasionally glanced at the other recruits, who trudged on with a unified determination. Even those who struggled had friends pulling them along, encouraging them. It was so different from Corlith training, where each warrior was expected to be self-reliant, to stand or fall alone. The thought both intrigued and frustrated him. How could these humans keep going under such strain? He reached a breaking point around mile 10, stumbling slightly. Ivan, looking back, halted his stride just long enough to let Grak catch up. Then he offered a terse nod, as if to say, "I'm not leaving you behind." The unspoken solidarity jarred Grak's worldview. On Corlith, to stumble was weakness. It was an insult to ask others to wait for you. Yet here, the entire squad worked as a cohesive unit, unwilling to abandon a single member. Their definition of strength seemed more collective, and that confounded him. Eventually, they made it back to the base, bodies exhausted and drenched, but the line remained intact. Grak collapsed onto a bench, carefully removing the massive rucksack as though it were a boulder. Around him, a sea of equally tired recruits gulped water and collapsed in similar poses. Drill instructors strode around, barking instructions or demands to stand if someone had dared to sink too low. Grak stared at the ground, black spots dancing in his vision. He needed a moment to steady himself, to keep from passing out. In that brief respite, a fluttering insect landed on his forearm. He glanced down curiously, noticing how small and delicate it looked compared to the thick ridges of muscle. A stinger glinted in the sunlight. Without warning, it jabbed. Grak let out a low snarl, reflexively swatting at it. The bug, some creature called a wasp, or perhaps a bee, flew off, leaving behind a searing pain that bloomed across the skin. The translator implant crackled with half-formed curses. He had survived battles on Corlith, repelled invasions in the outer colonies, but apparently, Earth's tiny creatures could inflict quick bursts of misery. Another lesson in humility. They had no more than a 30-minute break before a new challenge was thrown at them: weapon drills. While Grak might have hoped for at least a few hours' rest, Marine training was relentless. Under a scorching sun, the recruits were herded toward a firing range. There, they were handed rifles, what the humans called M4 or M27 variants. Grak gripped one gingerly, uncertain how to handle such a primitive ballistic device. On Corlith, their energy rifles fired beams that produced minimal recoil, relying on sophisticated gravitic dampeners. This crude Earth rifle had none of that. In front of them lay a series of targets, set at varying distances. Instructor Rodriguez gave a demonstration of proper stance. The recruits spread out. Grak lifted the rifle, following the example. He could feel the tension in his arms. At the command to fire, the first shot cracked through the range. Grak gasped as the butt of the rifle slammed into his shoulder, sending a shock wave through his bones. The translator caught him muttering something about violent mechanical madness. He had not expected such a jarring sensation. The second shot was no better. He found himself wavering on his footing, body unprepared for the repeated impact. Meanwhile, the recruits around him methodically fired round after round, adjusting their aim between shots with practiced ease. As humiliating as it felt, Grak swallowed his pride and asked Thomas for help. They paused between volleys, Thomas guiding Grak's stance, repositioning his feet. "Lean forward," he said. "Pull the stock tight into your shoulder. Keep your cheek against the buttstock. Anticipate the recoil." It still hurt, but after some adjustments, Grak managed a semblance of controlled firing. Even so, his grouping on the target was erratic, nowhere near the tight clusters the experienced recruits achieved. A flush of frustration burned through him. He was supposed to be the mightiest warrior from Corlith, but here he struggled at the simplest tasks. By the end of the weapon drill, his shoulder felt bruised, his ears rang despite the protective gear, and a persistent headache throbbed at his temples. The day wasn't finished yet, of course. A mandatory swim test followed. The group trudged toward an indoor pool facility. Grak peeled off his boots, scowling at how raw his feet felt. The smell of chlorine assaulted his nostrils. On Corlith, watery bodies were less common, and swimming was never a primary component of training. He stepped onto the wet tiles that lined the pool. With everyone else, he jumped in, only to find that the water's density, combined with his naturally heavier musculature, caused him to sink more than float. Panic fluttered in his chest. He kicked and thrashed, barely keeping his head above water. Thomas swam over, hooking an arm around him. "Relax. Kick more. Keep your torso aligned." But it was easier said than done. After several minutes of flailing, Grak wound up coughing out chlorinated water, thoroughly humbled yet again. Somehow he endured. The day dissolved into a blur of muscle aches, barked orders, forced marches from one station to another. By nightfall, he wanted nothing more than to collapse into unconsciousness. He found a bunk in the squad bay. Thomas was on one side, Ivan on the other. Several other recruits, Martinez, Kim, and a few others, either dozed or polished their gear. No one had the energy for idle conversation. Grak sat on the edge of the bunk, pressing a palm to the stinging wasp sting on his arm. In the dim lighting, he allowed himself to recall the moment he left Corlith, how proud he'd been to represent his people, how certain he'd been that Earth's training would be child's play. His illusions were shattered. This place was punishing, the environment relentlessly working against him. And the strangest part was watching how these humans aided one another, how they openly displayed a sense of camaraderie that on Corlith would be seen as coddling. Yet, as tired as he was, he felt a small spark of admiration for them. Their synergy was something unique, something that might be worth learning. The second day began before dawn. Instructor Rodriguez stormed into the barracks, flipping on lights and shouting at them to get up, dress, and form outside in 10 minutes. Everyone snapped awake. Grax stumbled into his uniform, ignoring the protests of his sore muscles. Outside, the pre-dawn air was still warm and thick. A quick roll call preceded a multi-hour course on the fundamentals of Marine Corps history and protocols. Grax sat in the back of the classroom, translator implant struggling to parse the rapid-fire lecture. He caught glimpses of legendary battles, famous figures in Earth's military heritage, all woven into the identity of these Marines. The concept of tradition fascinated him. On Corlith, tradition existed in an entirely different form. Ritual combat, genealogical ties, the forging of personal might. Here, tradition was shared across an entire force, binding them as a collective unit. By midday, he was out on a field exercise with Thomas, Ivan, and Martinez. The scenario involved clearing a mock village of simulated hostiles. Wooden buildings were set up in a cluster, with barrels, crates, and windows from which pop-up targets emerged. Grack kept messing up the standard room-clearing procedures. He swung his rifle too high, or stepped in front of teammates at the wrong moment, or forgot to call out movements in a timely manner. Time after time, the instructors chastised him for breaking formation or risking blue-on-blue incidents. It gnawed his pride. He was used to operating alone, trusting his own reflexes. But in Earth combat training, everything depended on coordinated movements. Each team member had a role. If one failed, all failed. Ivan approached him after one particularly dismal run. "You keep rushing ahead, big guy," he said, not unkindly. "We need to move as one. You watch left, I watch right. Thomas covers the rear." He patted Grack on the arm. "We do better next time, yes?" Grack inhaled, swallowing his inclination to snap back. Instead, he nodded. "Yes," he said, letting the words settle. "We do better next time." They repeated the drill. This time, he slowed down. He let Ivan direct him into position, carefully advanced with his rifle at the correct height, and remembered to communicate before turning corners. The difference was stark. They nailed the run, hitting targets accurately, finishing with no friendly fire mistakes. The squad was breathless but triumphant. Despite his best efforts to suppress it, Grack felt a spark of pride. Not because he had demonstrated raw power, but because he had contributed to a seamless group performance. It went on like that for the rest of the week, a cycle of exhaustion, adaptation, fleeting successes, and relentless difficulties. There were moments of near collapse, like during a forced march at night, when Grack discovered that the shape of his boots and his physiology led to massive blisters. Every step felt like walking on shards of glass. Thomas offered him moleskin bandages and advice on adjusting the laces. Ivan helped carry some extra ammunition when Grack lagged behind. Each instance chipped away at the notion that he had to do it all alone. On Corlith, such assistance might be seen as an insult, but here it was the norm. Of course, moments of tension still arose. One afternoon, after a frustrating session at the firing range, Grack overheard Thomas joking to a friend about how the big green alien can't handle a little recoil. It was meant as teasing camaraderie, but the words stung. Rage flared in Grack's chest. He confronted Thomas in front of the entire squad, fists clenched. The argument escalated as both men traded barbs. It nearly came to blows when Ivan and Martinez stepped in. Instructor Rodriguez threatened them all with punishment duty if they didn't stand down immediately. Later that evening, Thomas found Grack alone near the barracks and apologized for the careless words. They settled the dispute in a quiet, awkward moment, each acknowledging the cultural gap in how they perceived insults and jokes. By the end of that conversation, they understood each other better, forging a stronger bond than before. Then came the crisis that nearly ended Grack's entire mission. He and his squad were out on a field exercise in a dense patch of forest, practicing navigation and movement under simulated combat conditions. The humidity was overwhelming, and mosquitoes, or some blood-sucking insect, pestered them at every turn. Grack was lagging behind, scowling at the map in his hand, trying to decipher the swirling lines that indicated elevation changes. Suddenly, something bit him, a sharp jolt of pain on his calf. He looked down to see a small serpent slithering away into the undergrowth, its fangs dripping with what might have been venom. Grak's heart lurched. He staggered, dropping to one knee. Thomas was the first to notice. He sprinted back, saw the puncture wounds, and yelled for a medic. The rest of the team gathered around, radioing their position. Within minutes, Grak's vision began to tunnel. His body, unaccustomed to earth toxins, reacted violently. His translator sputtered as he tried to speak. He caught glimpses of Thomas lifting him, Ivan supporting his other side. He was hardly aware of the chaotic dash through the forest. The medics arrived eventually, treating him with anti-venom and rushing him to a field infirmary. Time blurred. He drifted between delirium and a bleak sense of dread. All the while, one thought repeated: if I fail now, I dishonor Corlith. He regained consciousness hours later, and 4-line in his arm, feeling strangely weightless. The medics had stabilized him. A wave of relief rushed through him as he flexed his toes, realizing he was alive. Thomas, Ivan, and even Martinez hovered by the makeshift bed, looking haggard. They perked up when they saw his eyes open. He struggled to sit up, wincing at the soreness in his leg and the pounding in his skull. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, big guy, don't move too fast. You almost kicked the bucket out there." For a moment, Grak was silent, grappling with a mix of gratitude and residual anger at himself for showing weakness. Finally, he managed a hoarse thank you, a phrase foreign to Corlith custom, but APT for the moment. Thomas nodded. "We leave no one behind," he said simply. Ivan chimed in. "And that means you too." They exchanged small grins, no more than a brief flash, but it carried weight. The following days were a slow climb back to full duty, but the bond that formed during that rescue became pivotal. No longer did Grak see Thomas and Ivan merely as brash humans out to prove their own worth. He began to respect them as true comrades. The entire squad seemed to close ranks around him, offering moral support and practical tips whenever. He struggled, and ironically, the more he accepted their help, the better he became at each task. He learned to fire the rifle with passable aim, to handle forced marches without lagging too far behind, to tackle the pool exercises with a half-decent stroke. He even managed to down an MRE meal without gagging on the synthetic flavors. Each small victory felt monumental. Finally, after many weeks of unrelenting training, the rumor swept through the base. The Crucible was coming. The recruits who'd lasted this long would face a final, grueling test, a 54-hour trial of minimal sleep, intense team-based challenges, and a final force march that demanded every ounce of endurance. Grak's stomach twisted when he heard the details. He had come so far, but was he truly ready for the most notorious piece of Marine training? The night before the Crucible, the squad was given a bit of extra downtime. They shared a subdued meal together. Grak listened quietly as some of the humans talked about their families or about the relief they'd feel when they officially earned the title of Marine. Ivan reminisced about the frozen winters of his hometown, while Thomas spoke of the Colorado mountains. Martinez joked about how he planned to sleep for a week straight after the ceremony. An undercurrent of nervous excitement crackled in the air. Grak found himself oddly comforted by their presence. He realized that no matter how alien Earth had felt at first, these soldiers were now his clan, at least for this mission. Then it began. In the darkness before dawn, the recruits assembled, weighed down by fully loaded packs that felt heavier than ever. The instructors, including Rodriguez, walked among them, checking gear, issuing last-minute orders. One by one, the squad set off. Grak, Thomas, Ivan, and Martinez were assigned to move as a fire team. Their objective: navigate to various stations spread out across the training grounds, complete tasks that tested teamwork, and endure the physical onslaught of endless miles on foot. The initial hours weren't too bad. Adrenaline carried them through the first obstacles, climbing walls, pulling sleds loaded with sandbags, carrying ammunition crates. Grak leveraged his brute strength to help the team, hoisting gear up and over barriers. He felt the sting of pride each time they succeeded. But as time wore on, fatigue seeped in. The sun rose, beating down mercilessly. They stopped only briefly to sip water or choke down an energy bar. Sleep was a luxury they wouldn't see for another day at least. By the second night, after clearing the tent station and forging a shallow river crossing, they were all swaying on their feet, half-dazed. The forced march to the next checkpoint spanned nearly 15 miles. For Grak, every step was torture. He found himself recalling the earliest days on Earth, how even a shorter distance had nearly broken him. Now he was battered, dehydrated, and running on scant hours of sleep. His mind began to blur reality with memories of Corlith. He thought of home, of how the gravity was slightly less, the air richer. Would his people see him as a failure if he gave up? He forced the thought away. Thomas walked beside him, occasionally tapping his shoulder and telling him to keep pace. At some point in that endless trek, Grak's body tried to shut down. He stumbled, blackness encroaching on his vision. Thomas looped an arm around him, then Ivan joined on the other side. Together, they practically dragged him forward, ignoring the rule that each person must carry their own gear. "If we don't do this, we all fail," Thomas muttered. Ivan simply tightened his grip, face grim but resolute. Grak lost track of time. He vaguely recalled a station where they had to build a makeshift bridge across a ravine using planks and ropes. Another where they had to treat a simulated casualty under fire. Each challenge demanded mental focus, but Grak was running on fumes. Miraculously, under the watchful glare of instructors, they managed to complete every station. The team clung to each other's strengths like lifelines. When one faltered, the others stepped in without hesitation. Then came the final march to the finishing point. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grak's heart hammered. He blinked salty sweat out of his eyes, unsure if it was truly morning or a hallucination. He felt Thomas and Ivan let go of him so he could attempt the last half-mile under his own power. He inhaled a ragged breath, forced one foot in front of the other, summoning the last remnants of willpower. Each step was a small victory over exhaustion, over despair. When he finally saw the muster area, where instructors waited like statues, a sob escaped his throat, half laugh, half weeping. He trudged forward, crossing the imaginary line that marked the end of the ordeal. Thomas, Ivan, Martinez, they stumbled beside him, and all four collapsed in an unceremonious heap. They had made it. The entire squad had made it. In a haze of exhaustion, Grak heard the echoing shouts of joy from other recruits, saw instructors handing out a small emblem. He recognized it as the Marine Corps emblem, the eagle, globe, and anchor. One of the instructors, a gentler one than Rodriguez, knelt down and pressed the emblem into Grak's hand. His translator implant picked up her words, "You earned this. Welcome to the Brotherhood." He closed his fingers around the symbol, his vision swimming with tears of both exhaustion and an emotion he could hardly name. That day blurred into the next. There was a short graduation ceremony of sorts. The recruits, newly minted Marines, stood tall despite their aching bodies. They received official recognition in front of a small crowd of senior officers and a handful of visitors. Grak was singled out for his unique status, the first Corlith warrior to pass Marine boot camp. He stood at attention, feeling both triumph and humility. Thomas and Ivan grinned ear to ear, as though they had known all along he could do it, maybe even more than he believed in himself. A few days later, Grak wandered the corridors of a diplomatic vessel in Earth's orbit, preparing for his return trip to Corlith. He still limped slightly from the muscle strain of the crucible, and a few new scars marked his arms. But he held himself differently now, not just with the stiff pride of a Corlith champion, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the value of unity. As he approached a junction, he saw a human wearing a crisp uniform of some interstellar delegation. The man limped as well, sporting an odd contraption on his own leg. "You must be the Marine from Corlith training, right?" the man asked, voice tinted with humor. "Name's Lance Corporal Thomas Reeves. I just got back from your planet's training. Let me tell you, that methane swamp nearly ate me alive." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. Grak recognized the same weary triumph in his eyes. the shared, unspoken bond of having endured an alien world's worst. I heard your swamps are intense, Grax said. We have beasts there that can crush a tank. So, how did you manage? Thomas Reeves just grinned. Sheer stubbornness, friend. Seems like we both learned something about that. They shook hands, exchanging a look of mutual respect. No further explanation was needed. Both had proven themselves in the crucible of foreign military training, each standing as a testament to how even the strongest warrior can be humbled, taught, and ultimately transformed by an unfamiliar environment. The human parted with a casual salute, heading to his own transport. Grack lingered, letting the quiet hum of the vessel settle around him. In the distance, through a small porthole, he caught a glimpse of Earth hanging against the void. He lifted the Marine Corps emblem in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined forging such bonds with humans, those creatures he once believed to be frail. But they had saved his life, and in turn, they had given him a new perspective on strength. It was found not only in brute force, but in unity, selflessness, and a willingness to trust one's comrades. He had come to Earth to prove the might of Corlith's greatest warrior. Instead, he had discovered that might alone was incomplete. True power, he realized, was a shared bond, one that could bridge the gap between worlds. He thought of Thomas, Ivan, Martinez, and even the stoic instructor Rodriguez, who had once pinned him with that fierce glare. He remembered the long nights of training, the exhaustion that blurred the edges of reality, the moments of near breaking when a simple helping hand from a teammate made the difference between failure and success. He remembered the bitter tang of fear when he'd been bitten by Earth's venomous snake, and the relief that flooded through him when his squad refused to abandon him. Each memory told him the same lesson. It was not weakness to lean on others. It was survival. It was growth. Soon, the engines of the diplomatic vessel hummed with the power of departure. Grack took one last look at Earth, then turned to board his shuttle back to Corlith. His superiors there would expect a triumphant report, full of tales proving Corlith's superiority. He would indeed share stories of how he overcame adversity, but he would also include the surprising revelations he had encountered, the empathy and determination of the Marine Corps, the unstoppable force of teamwork, and the respect he gained for the humans who live by the creed of never leaving a fellow soldier behind. As the shuttle door sealed shut and the engines roared to life, Grack felt a pang of something akin to nostalgia for a place he had initially loathed. He thought of the next generation of recruits, both Corlith and human, who might someday undertake similar exchange programs. Let them learn these lessons without the barrier of arrogance he had clung to at first. Let them see that in the space between worlds, unity was not just a choice, but a necessity. He sat back in his seat, the harness comfortably adjusted this time. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they had clearance to leave Earth's orbit. With a gentle rumble, the shuttle detached from the diplomatic vessel, drifting into the starry vastness. Grack closed his eyes for a moment, breathing evenly, focusing on the steady pulse of his heart. He thought of the finishing line of the Crucible, that final march in the dawn light, where everything hurt, but he had kept going because Thomas, Ivan, and the rest had refused to let him quit. Perhaps, he mused, the humans were not so primitive after all. They had taught him something no textbook, no combat manual on Corlith had ever conveyed so vividly. And as the shuttle set course for the jump gate that would propel him across the galaxy back to his home, he quietly whispered a phrase he had heard many times from the humans, a phrase that now made a profound sense in his chest. Semper Fi, always faithful. He intended to keep that vow, for in some strange, unspoken way, he was now a Marine too. The strongest warrior Corlith had sent, tempered by the fires of a boot camp he once thought too easy, but which proved to be among the hardest challenges he had ever faced. And he carried with him not just a new perspective, but an emblem that symbolized a bond transcending star systems. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as the shuttle's engines engaged full thrust. Earth's blue crescent receded behind them, but a piece of it, a part of its spirit, traveled forever in Grack's heart.